All right, welcome back, everyone. We're ready for another deep dive, and today we're going to be looking at some recent economic news from India, focusing specifically on their exports and their trade deficit. And just in case you need a little bit of a reminder, a trade deficit basically means a country is spending more on imports than it's earning from exports. But as we're going to find out today, it's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, there are a lot of really interesting nuances when it comes to trade deficits, and especially when it comes to a country like India, which is seeing a lot of growth. So one of the things that we're going to be unpacking is, did you know that India's exports actually decreased recently? That might sound a little bit alarming at first, but we're going to explore why that might not be as bad as it sounds and what it could actually mean for their economy in the long run.
I'm really looking forward to breaking down these numbers with you
Yeah.
because sometimes they can seem a little dry, but as you said, there's always a really fascinating story behind them, especially when it comes to economics.
Exactly. So let's dive right in and we'll start with some of the key figures that are highlighted in the India's Exports Contract 1% article. So according to this article in December 2024, India's exports fell by 1%, totaling $38.01 billion. Now, this is compared to December 2023, so it's a year-over-year comparison. But get this, during that same month, imports actually climbed by almost 5%, hitting $59.95 billion. So that resulted in a trade deficit of $21.94 billion just for the month of December. So at first glance, that deficit figure might seem a little bit, well, concerning, but I'm guessing it's not quite as straightforward as that, right?
Well, absolutely not. Whenever we're talking about economics, context is everything. So,
Yeah.
for example, same article that you mentioned actually points out that for the entire period between April and December of 2024, India actually saw a 1.6% increase in exports
hmm
and a 5.15% increase in imports. So the question then becomes, how do we reconcile that kind of overall upward trend with this dip that we're seeing in December?
hmm
Are there some global factors that might be influencing India's export performance?
Mm.
Or are there some things happening within India's economy that might be driving these shifts?
Yeah, that is super interesting. I mean, if both their imports and their exports were generally going up throughout the fiscal year, why that sudden decrease in exports in December? I mean, could it just be like a blip, an anomaly? Or is it a sign of something more significant? And then on the flip side, what about that overall increase in imports? I mean, does that just mean that people in India are spending more? Or could it potentially point to something a bit more strategic, like investments in certain key industries?
That's a really great point. Because a lot of times when we think about imports, we tend to think about consumer goods, things that people are buying. But you have to remember that for a growing economy like India's, they actually need to import more, not just for people to buy stuff, but to actually help fuel their own expansion. For example, let's say they're trying to, really boost their manufacturing sector or really push forward in the tech industry. Well, to do that, they're probably going to need to import things like specialized equipment, maybe some advanced technology, or even just raw materials.
So it's not just about the total value of those imports, but also about what's actually being imported.
Right.
Like, are they bringing in finished products that are ready to be sold to consumers? Or are they bringing in the kind of the building blocks that they need to actually produce things themselves?
Exactly. It's kind of like if you're looking at a recipe,
Huh.
you know, you want to know what ingredients are they using to make their economic cake, so to speak.
Haha, I like that. So are they importing flour, sugar, and eggs to bake their own cake? Or are they just going out and buying a cake that's already made? So in that sense, a trade deficit isn't inherently a good or bad thing, right? Really all comes down to what's driving it. So let's dig a little deeper into those ingredients. What can we learn by looking at the specific sectors that are contributing to this increase in imports in India?
Well, one area that's seen a pretty big jump in imports is electronic components. And this suggests that India's tech industry, which is, really booming right now, is definitely playing a role. They might be importing these components to assemble devices within India, which would actually support their Make in India initiative.
Oh, that makes sense. And, it really aligns with their goal of becoming a major player in the global tech scene. But even within that electronic sector, there are nuances, right? Like, are they importing smartphones that are already put together? Or are they focusing on bringing in the chips and the displays that they need to actually manufacture their own devices? I mean, that level of detail can give us a much better understanding of their overall economic strategy.
Absolutely. And to get an even better graph of that strategy, we need to look beyond just individual sectors and consider the bigger picture, the global landscape. For example, trade agreements can have a really significant impact on a country's trade dynamics.
That's interesting. We hear a lot about trade agreements, but I'll be honest, I don't always fully grasp how they actually affect a country like India.
Well, One prominent example is something called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP. And India ultimately chose not to join this agreement. And that decision was largely driven by concerns about what would happen if their market was suddenly flooded with cheaper goods from other countries that were part of the agreement. There were worries that it could potentially harm some of their domestic industries.
So even though India is, clearly participating in global trade, they're also being very strategic about protecting their own interests
Hmm.
and making sure that they're fostering growth within their own country.
Exactly. It's like they're trying to find that sweet spot where they can leverage the benefits of global trade, but also make sure that their domestic economy is healthy and resilient for the long term.
This has been incredibly insightful so far. I'm already starting to see this whole trade deficit thing in a completely different light. It's not just about subtracting one number from another. It's really a reflection of a country's aspirations, their choices, and their place in this complex global economy.
I completely agree. And you know what? We've only just scratched the surface. As we continue this deep dive, we're going to be exploring how these trade dynamics connect with other really important factors. Like, for instance, all the incredible advancements in technology and maybe even more importantly, how all of this actually impacts the lives of everyday people in India.
Okay, now I am really intrigued. Because it's one thing to talk about numbers and economic indicators, but at the end of the day, what really matters is how these global forces are affecting real people and real communities.
You got it. And that's exactly what we're going to do in the next part of our deep dive, so stay tuned.
Can't wait. Okay, so we're back, and I'm still thinking about everything we talked about in that last segment about India's trade dynamics. It's just crazy how you can start with a single number like the trade deficit, and it just opens up this whole world of economic insights.
It really is fascinating, isn't it? We tend to focus on those big headline numbers, but
Yeah.
it's really the details underneath that tell the real story.
And you mentioned earlier that India's decision to not join the RCEP trade agreement was a strategic one. Could you maybe unpack that a little bit more for us? Like, what were some of the key factors that went into that decision, and what does it tell us about how India approaches global trade?
Yeah, sure. So the RCEP, which stands for Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, it's a really big trade agreement. It includes 15 countries across the Asia-Pacific region. And the basic goal is to reduce tariffs and trade barriers,
Yeah.
to make it easier for goods and services to flow between these countries.
So why wouldn't India want to be a part of that? I mean, it seems like it would open up a huge market for their exports.
Right, and that's where the strategic thinking comes in. Because while the RCEP definitely has some potential benefits, India also had some pretty big concerns. One of the main worries was that it could lead to a big influx of cheaper goods, especially from China, and that could have put some of their domestic industries at a disadvantage.
Ah, okay, I see. So they didn't want to be in a situation where they were suddenly flooded with imports that could hurt their own producers.
Exactly. And another concern was the potential impact on sensitive sectors like agriculture. There were worries that opening up to cheaper agricultural imports could end up hurting Indian farmers.
So it seems like they made a calculated decision to prioritize protecting their own industries and the livelihoods of their people, even if it meant maybe missing out on some potential export opportunities in the short term.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
It just goes to show that navigating global trade, it's not always straightforward. It's not always a simple case of more trade equals more growth. There are often trade-offs to consider, and India was clearly thinking strategically about those trade-offs.
This whole discussion is making me think about something you said earlier about the importance of diversification. I'm curious, how does diversification fit into India's overall trade strategy? And what role does it play in managing their trade deficit?
Well, diversification is really key for any country that wants to build a resilient trade strategy. And it's especially important for a country like India that's aiming for sustainable growth. When we talk about diversification, we're really looking at it from two main angles. One is export market diversification, and the other is product diversification.
So it's not just about what they're exporting, but also where they're sending those exports.
Right. So when it comes to export markets, you want to avoid relying too heavily on just a few trading partners. Because if something happens in one of those markets, like let's say there's an economic downturn or maybe demand for your products changes suddenly, well, that can have a really big impact on your exports and on your overall economic stability.
It's like that old saying, don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. By spreading their exports across a wider range of markets, India can kind of cushion themselves against those risks. and create a more stable and predictable export base.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And what about product diversification? How does that work?
Well, with product diversification, the focus is on expanding the range of goods and services that a country exports. So instead of relying on just a few key products, they try to develop a more diverse portfolio of offerings. This not only helps to reduce their vulnerability to changes in demand for specific products, but it also allows them to tap into new markets and take advantage of emerging trends.
So instead of just focusing on, let's say, textiles or agricultural products, they're branching out into things like pharmaceuticals, technology services, or maybe even components for renewable energy.
Exactly. And India has actually been making a lot of progress in diversifying their export basket, and it's really starting to pay off. For example, their pharmaceutical and IT services sectors have become major contributors to their export earnings in recent years.
And this diversification helps them to manage their trade deficit, but it also just makes their overall economy more resilient, right?
Absolutely. A more diversified economy is better equipped to handle shocks, and it can adapt more easily to changing global conditions.
It's really starting to become clear that India is taking a very deliberate approach to trade. They're not just passively participating in the global market. They're making strategic choices, prioritizing domestic growth, but also looking for ways to expand their global footprint.
It's a dynamic and evolving strategy for sure. And it'll be really interesting to see how they continue to adapt and navigate the complexities of global trade in the coming years.
And speaking of adapting, we can't ignore the elephant in the room, which is technology. You mentioned earlier that technological advancements are really shaking things up in the world of global trade. Can you tell us a bit more about that? And how is technology specifically playing out in India?
Oh, that's a huge topic, and it's definitely one that deserves its own deep dive. But we're seeing some incredible advancements right now in things like automation, artificial intelligence, and digital platforms. And these technologies they're really reshaping industries and trade patterns all over the world.
I mean, yeah, it's something we're all experiencing in our daily lives, but I'm curious about how it's playing out on a national and global economic scale.
Well, one key way is through automation. As manufacturing processes become more and more automated,
Hmm.
it's really changing the dynamics of global production and trade. Countries that can effectively use these technologies might see a boost in their manufacturing capabilities and become more competitive. But others might struggle with things like job displacement and economic disruption.
So India needs to be smart about how they embrace these advancements. They need to figure out how to capitalize on the opportunities, but also how to mitigate the risks.
Exactly. And they're already starting to make moves in that direction. The Make in India initiative that we talked about before is partly about attracting investments in advanced manufacturing
Mhm.
and encouraging companies to adopt these new
Yeah,
technologies.
that's good to hear. So it sounds like they're not just reacting to these changes, but they're actively trying to shape their strategy to embrace the future of technology.
And another important factor is the rise of the digital economy. E-commerce platforms, online services, digital content, all of these things they're becoming more and more important in global trade. And India, with its large and tech-savvy population, is in a really good position to benefit from this trend.
That's true. I mean, India has a really thriving tech sector, and
Yeah.
they're already doing really well in things like software development and IT services. But I imagine there are also some challenges. Right.
Of course. Bridging the digital divide and making sure that everyone has equal access to technology and digital literacy. Those are going to be crucial if they want to reach their full potential in the digital economy.
So it sounds like technology is both a catalyst for growth and a potential source of disruption for India. They need to find that balance between harnessing its power and addressing the challenges that it brings.
You got it. It's a complex and constantly changing landscape.
Yep.
And India's success will depend on their ability to navigate these technological shifts effectively.
This whole conversation has been so eye-opening. We started by talking about India's trade deficit, and now we've explored trade agreements, diversification strategies, and even the impact of technological advancements. It's clear that India's economic journey is multifaceted with both challenges and opportunities ahead.
And we've only just begun to scratch the surface. There's
Mhm.
there's so much more to explore, especially when we start to think about the human side of these economic shifts.
I'm really looking forward to diving into that in the next part of our deep dive. We've talked about trade policies and diversification and technology, but ultimately it all comes down to how these things affect the lives of everyday people in India.
Absolutely. And that's exactly where we're headed next. We're going to explore the social and economic implications of these trade dynamics and examine how they affect workers, consumers, and communities across India. So stay tuned.
All right, welcome back to our deep dive into India's economic landscape. It's been a pretty fascinating journey so far.
Yeah, it really has. We've covered so much ground from their trade deficit to their approach to global agreements like that, RCP, and even touched on the whole world of technology and how it's impacting trade.
Yeah, and it's really clear that India is operating in a very, dynamic and ever-changing economic environment. And now I kind of want to shift gears a little bit and focus on something that we touched on briefly earlier, but I think deserves a little more attention. The human element. We've been talking about trade figures and diversification strategies and all these technological advancements. But at the end of the day, those are really just tools and indicators. What really matters is how all of this is actually impacting the lives of real people.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's easy to get caught up in the big picture, the macroeconomic trends.
Right.
But we have to remember that economics is ultimately about people, their choices,
Yeah.
and their well-being.
So let's bring it down to that ground level. How are these global trade dynamics and these policy choices that we've been talking about, how are they affecting workers, consumers, and communities across India?
Well, let's start with workers. As India is, trying to grow their manufacturing sector and become more competitive on a global scale, there's a big emphasis on attracting investment and creating jobs. And that's where initiatives like Make in India come into play.
Right, right. We talked about that a bit earlier, encouraging companies to set up those production facilities within India, not just to, serve the domestic market, but also to boost exports.
Exactly, but it's not just about creating any jobs. It's about creating good jobs, jobs that offer fair wages, safe working conditions, and opportunities for people to advance, to improve their skills and move up. And that's where the social dimension of trade policy becomes really important.
So it's not just about, okay, let's get those factories built, let's get those production lines running. It's also about making sure that the workers who are, the backbone of those operations are being treated fairly and that they have the opportunity to build a better life for themselves.
You got it. If the goal is to have sustainable and inclusive growth, then the well-being of workers has to be a top priority.
That makes a lot of sense. And what about consumers? How are they being impacted by all of this?
Well, one of the most direct impacts is on prices. Trade policies can have a big influence on how much imported goods cost. And that, of course, affects how much consumers end up paying for everything, from, electronics and clothing to basic things like food.
So if India decides to put tariffs on certain imported goods, those costs are probably going to get passed on to the consumer in the end.
Yeah, in a lot of cases, that's exactly what happens. And this is where policymakers really have to walk a tightrope.
Right.
Because on one hand, tariffs can help to protect domestic industries from, being undercut by cheaper imports. But on the other hand, they can also make it harder for consumers to afford, essential goods.
It's a tough trade-off, and there's no easy answer. They have to weigh those potential benefits for domestic producers against the potential impact on people's wallets.
Exactly. And it's not just about prices either. Trade agreements can also affect the availability and the variety of products that are available to consumers. So for example, if India decides to open up its market to a wider range of imported goods, well, that could mean that consumers have more choices and maybe even lower prices on some things.
But then there's also that risk that domestic producers might struggle to compete.
Right.
It's just this really complex web of interconnected factors.
It really is. And it's
Yeah.
important to remember that these impacts that we're talking about, they don't affect everyone equally. Some groups are going to be more vulnerable than others. Low-income households, for instance, or people in rural areas. They might be hit harder by things like sudden changes in trade policies.
So it's not enough to just look at the overall economic numbers. We also have to think about how those policies are actually playing out in people's lives and make sure that everyone is benefiting from economic growth.
You got it. That's why it's so important to have these kinds of conversations, to bring different voices and perspectives to the table, and to really think critically about these issues.
I couldn't agree more. And this whole conversation has been a perfect example of that. We started with this, seemingly simple headline about India's trade deficit, and now we've gone so much deeper. We've explored all these complex factors that are shaping India's economic journey, and most importantly, how those factors are actually playing out in the lives of real people.
And that's what it's all about in the end, isn't it? Economics isn't just about numbers and graphs. It's about people, their well-being, and their hopes for the future.
Well said. As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm just really struck by how intricate everything is. This whole web of global forces and policy choices and human experiences that are shaping our world.
And hopefully our listeners are feeling that too.
Mhm.
A sense of curiosity, a desire to keep learning and exploring these connections, and to keep having these thoughtful conversations about the challenges and the opportunities that we all face.
Absolutely. And listeners, thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. We hope that this deep dive has sparked your own curiosity and encouraged you to look beyond the headlines, to think about the human stories behind the economic data, and to stay engaged in this really important conversation about how we can build a more equitable and sustainable future for everyone.